Now, by the way, he says at one point, sort of tellingly, as a young man, he says, "My calling is quite clear to me. What God will make of it, I do not know."
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome everyone to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam Camp, and I'm your host, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Always a pleasure, Sam.
Pleasure's all mine, Richard. It's all mine. I'll keep saying this, even though I think I've begun every recent podcast with this, but we do have a spiritual leadership coaching workshop coming up. I think it's very important if you work with people. These are some great skills you will learn in a 3-day in-person setting. Yep. You get to practice and see how coaching is done. Yeah. The way that we do it, led by Bob Royal. You're going to be there as well, and Brett Pyle. And the one we've got coming up in our neck of the woods, at least, is going to be October 28th and 30th. And you can use code EARLYBIRD at checkout for $100 off. That's good until September 30th. But it's a great time to add some new tools, to learn how to ask better questions, to help move people onto God's agenda. So I'll leave links to that in the show notes as always, and you can find out more at blackabycoaching.org. Anything to add to that, Richard?
Well, it's going to be at our church where you and I are members, and so it's kind of our home base where our BMI offices are, and so our staff is there, and I'm able to be there more often in those workshops because it's close by, and I think such a powerful time, right? Especially in these days, to be able to join in what God's doing in someone else's life is a powerful thing. Yeah. And so there's some skills and perspectives involved that you had perhaps never thought about before. And so really encourage people to just hone those skills. If you're a pastor, if you're a parent, if you're in management, if you just want to be a good friend to people and just bring out the best in them. Certainly a worthwhile investment of a couple of days.
Absolutely. And if Atlanta's too far of a journey for you, we've got some also in South Dakota and Pennsylvania this fall. So you can check out all of the details for those at blackabycoaching.org. But today we're talking about someone who's pretty, I think, legendary in Christendom, at least, and that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah. Famously wrote The Cost of Discipleship. He was also part of a assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler during World War II. Fascinating person. I've to be honest, have not really delved much into his biography, and I know I'll put out a little shameless plug here for something I do with your son Daniel, and that's The Collision. You can go to thecollision.org to find out more. But one of the things that we do is we review movies, and there is a movie on sort of a biopic on Bonhoeffer coming out later this fall, and so you can head over there to check that out. But I'm fascinated to see what you've uncovered about Bonhoeffer and learn more about the man, the myth, the legend.
Well, he is an interesting person, and of course, some people become larger than life as time goes on. One of the reasons he becomes so famous, of course, is because of how he dies. He dies prematurely, hung on orders of Adolf Hitler himself, about 2 weeks before Hitler commits suicide himself. And so almost makes it to the end of World War II. And Hitler almost in a fit of spite, knowing that his days are numbered, but wanting to take out as many of his enemies as he could beforehand. Make sure that Bonhoeffer goes to the gallows. And so he dies at age 39. Doesn't even hit 40. And yet what's interesting, of course, is how some people can do so much in a relatively small amount of time. I was struck also, I've just read some on Blaise Pascal, and he died at age 39 as well. And so some of these brilliant people, that doesn't take a long life necessarily to make a significant contribution. But Bonhoeffer is he's German, of course, and he is in a family that is very well educated. In fact, his biographer says that for perhaps 200 years or so, you can go back up his family tree, and they're all professionals, very celebrated, accomplished people, brilliant people. And it makes you wonder sometimes, people have kind of looked at my family with all the ministers in it, and you wonder sometimes. I've been fascinated by how do you develop that, where there's just you've created this culture in your family of thinkers, of accomplished people, driven, ambitious to do well, to think. And so the Bonhoeffer family was highly respected, very professional. His father was a leading psychologist based in Berlin. And so Bonhoeffer's well connected, well respected. There's a lot of doors. In one sense, when you live your life well with integrity, you're a blessing to many. Then oftentimes that means that doors will open to your children and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly experienced that because of my father. Opportunities that have come my way just because my dad lived his life well.
Yeah.
And so Bonhoeffer seems to be one of those people that over the course of 2 centuries of a family that made some wise choices, that valued education, valued thinking. The Bonhoeffer family apparently had a number of sons and some daughters, and they and the father, highly educated himself, pushed his children to think, to read, to study, to go to school. And so all of his kids grow up to be brilliant thinkers themselves, very successful. And so 2 of Bonhoeffer's brothers actually are killed in World War I. And you can imagine the tragedy of that. These are all brilliant young men that would have had great careers, but their lives are snuffed short. And their father said, I certainly grieve their loss, but I'm proud that they gave their life in such a way, which is interesting because in the next World War, a Bonhoeffer is going to try to take out the leader of the country.
Yeah.
And Bonhoeffer, his father's a psychologist. He's got engineer brothers and people that are in the various fields that are very prominent, respected in the day. And ultimately, Bonhoeffer declares that he feels he's going to study theology, that he's going to devote his attention to the church. And famously, one of his brothers said of the church, he said, "The church is a poor, feeble, boring, petty, bourgeois institution." Not exactly
Ouch.
the most encouraging words to a little brother. But apparently Bonhoeffer's response was, in that case, I shall have to reform it. And I love that. Just his attitude was, I know the church is maybe not all that great right now, but it's important and it needs to be reformed.
There's a lot of confidence.
Yeah, it is also.
Or arrogance.
You could tell the way he's raised. He's raised to expect that his life will make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of those Bonhoeffer boys especially, and the daughters, they were just taught, they were raised that their life's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
So you just decide which field you're going to make a difference in, but expect that wherever you invest your life, you're going to make that part of your world better. And so he studies theology, but in Germany, at that time, quite famously, theology had become very, very academic, very heady. Of course, it will become the birthplace, the center of a lot of very liberal theology, which was essentially trying to take human reason and placing it even above Scripture, to just make, in a sense, theology respectable by making it fit with the latest trends in philosophy and other psychology and so on. So Bonhoeffer's going to go to the traditional schools, and he's going to study under actually some of the leading liberal theologians in the world. Adolf Harnack was one of the fathers of liberalism. And sometimes we don't realize that about Bonhoeffer, that his training was he learned under some of the most liberal professors in that day. Later, he's going to become friends with Karl Barth. He's going to know Emil Brunner. He really gets to sort of learn from the who's who of the great thinkers of the day, even though perhaps they're very liberal or neo-orthodox. And in that day, your training, even to be a minister, was basically very heady, very academic. Just study all these theologies and these views of Scripture, and study philosophy, and fill your head with all kinds of knowledge. And then each week you mount the pulpit and basically give some theological, heady, intellectual discourse, and that's kind of what church was. That's what ministry was. And so that's how Bonhoeffer starts out. And so, and what he's going to learn over time is how impractical that is. That it doesn't make a very good pastor. It might make a professor, but it does not make a good pastor. But he's getting the best training, the best education that is available to him. And then he's going to do some things that are kind of interesting. And now, by the way, he says at one point, sort of tellingly, as a young man, he says, "My calling is quite clear to me. What God will make of it, I do not know." Of course, looking later to realize, well, you could never have anticipated the life that Bonhoeffer would ultimately have. But and I think, in a sense, we could all perhaps say that God has a calling for all of us, and none of us could really anticipate. If we're really truly going to follow what God has for us, it's probably, God's going to have some twists and turns in his plan for us that we would never anticipate. Might be scared to death if we knew what they were. Well, he's going to become an international person. He gets a job as an associate pastor in a church in Barcelona, Spain, of all things, which is kind of interesting. He doesn't do a lot of his initial work in Germany itself. Partly, he's a young man, and it's kind of a government paid position. A lot of times the pastorates in that country, and so
sort of state sponsored.
And so
clergy.
You've got some folks in a very comfortable, sort of plush religious job, and so if you're a young guy that's passionate about changing the world, you got to take your time and pay your dues. And so he goes to Barcelona. He's also going to spend some time ministering in a church in England. And then he's going to go to Union Seminary in New York City. And of course, Union there is at that time is quite a liberal school. All of his training basically is going to be a liberal training. That minimizes the Word of God, that may perhaps doubts miracles, that psychologizes the Bible and Jesus' teachings. And it's really kind of remarkable that despite all that training, he's trying to find meaning. He's trying to find, this can't just be a heady intellectual journey. There's got to be truth here. There's got to be something that makes a difference in our world. Interesting, when he's in New York City, he's going to go to Riverside Church, which at that time, Harry Fosdick is the preacher, is probably the most best-known liberal preacher in America. And Bonhoeffer's just he's going to feel a certain emptiness. He's going to walk the streets of New York City and see some poverty, some racism. He's going to see injustices, and then he's going to hear this kind of liberal, feel-good sort of preaching, and just feel like there's got to be more than that. That's not enough. And he's going to look at his own training he's getting in his seminary classrooms and saying, but this all sounds sort of fun to debate in a seminary classroom, but you go back out into the world and it's just not adequate. And I know when I was a seminary president, I wrestled with that all the time. I knew that there were some foundational things that are good to learn and study, but you're always wrestling with, but if a person gets this education, will they be equipped to go into a beat up church or start a church in a community with a bunch of people that aren't interested in your religion, and you survive? And so you can, as you read, you see him trying to figure that out. And interestingly for Bonhoeffer, here's this very heady, intellectual, brilliant German, but he starts to visit some African American churches in New York City, in the area. And that may be the most influential thing on him, which you'd never think. Here's this German studying under the great liberal teachers of the day. But he goes to some African American churches and he hears them sing. He listens to them preach. He watches them trying to navigate a difficult life with God's word. And he sees power there that he hadn't seen before. He sees passion. It's not just all a heady thing. It's a heart thing. And it changes Bonhoeffer. And so, interestingly enough, it could have been a lot of African-American worship and church in America that shapes him for going back ultimately to Germany and taking on Hitler. He's going to write a book on discipleship called The Cost of Discipleship, and he's going to make some pretty profound statements. And some of those are going to be things that he won't even know how significant they are. For instance, of course, he famously says, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Yeah. And of course, that's what Bonhoeffer will do ultimately. But he just saw a Christianity that was not asking very much of people. It was just a heady, let's read this obscure philosophical book on Jesus that doesn't really tell you how to live. It just tickles your fancy. And you can just see Bonhoeffer is struggling with that it needs to be real.
Yeah.
It's about following Jesus. It's not about just discussing Jesus, not about just reading about Jesus. And interestingly, also, he is a pacifist. Of course, he's had two brothers killed in World War I. And he believes, just from his own theology, his own study, his own ethics, he's working out that it's just wrong to take life. And so he's ultimately going to change his views. And he says something kind of interesting. He says, it is not only my task to look after the victims of madmen who drive a motor car in a crowded street, but I do all in my power to stop their driving at all. And that's going to be his challenge. He's going to realize, it's fine to just say it's not right to kill, but if I see an Adolf Hitler who is mass murdering millions of people, does it not come to a point where it's better to kill him and stop him than to let him kill millions? And he's going to agonize over that. And of course, as Hitler comes to power, there's a huge debate back in Germany about how the church should respond to that. And of course, initially, although Hitler is very much an atheist, he's going to use the church. He's going to tell the church what they want to hear. And he's going to fuse patriotism with the church, and to say, if you're a loyal German, you're going to support the government, even and Bonhoeffer just realizes, he's a loyal German too, but he realizes he's got a loyalty to the kingdom of God first, and that is going to be an issue that even to this day Christians have to face. Mm-hmm. How can you be a good citizen, but also first a good citizen of the kingdom of God? And ultimately, Bonhoeffer is going to work and be in various committees and author declarations and other things and international summits, trying to wrestle with, as a good Christian, how do you relate to a government that is attacking people, rounding up Jews? is there not a certain point where, as a churchman, you've got to just stand up against that? But of course, if you're in a state church and your salary comes from the government, that gets a little more awkward than if you're independently paid by your congregation. And so Bonhoeffer's going to be very disappointed that many people in the state church are going to just continue to support the state and just say it's our duty to support the government no matter what they do. And he's going to see it as definitely a sellout. And ultimately, he's going to get to the point where he realizes, I can't just remain quiet. He's going to realize to remain silent is to endorse, to support evil. I have to find a way to oppose it. And so he's going to now he's going to be given. He's a brilliant man, and people are quite impressed with him everywhere he goes. And so as World War II breaks out, he is offered a job teaching at Union Seminary in New York. He's got he could stay in England. People want him there. He could go to Spain. He could do a lot of things. But he begins to, in his mind, he's wrestling with just his integrity to say, how can I, with integrity, how do I live my life? These are troubled times. And of course, you realize Bonhoeffer is just like all the rest of us. You don't get to choose the time in which you lead and live. He's a brilliant man. If he lived in a different age, he might have been a brilliant scholar at some famous seminary or university, but he's living at a time of World War II where his Germany, as he knows it, will never be the same again. And his whole culture and society is being just completely turned upside down. And so he's got to say, yeah, if I lived 100 years ago, it'd be different, but I live now. And so what should my career be? Should it just be trying to have a respectable teaching job like I would have in another time, or being a pastor in some comfortable parish where I get paid well and raise a family? Or in the day in which I live, how do I need to live here? And how does a Christian relate to a government that is pushing things that are not Christ-like, that are not God-honoring, that are even harmful? And so he's going to agonize over that. And interestingly, Bonhoeffer's going to struggle with some depression, just like a lot of other great leaders like Spurgeon and others are going to suffer, Churchill in the secular world. And of course, there's lots of reasons why people can suffer, especially clinical depression. But I think sometimes, too, people that are agonizing over great issues and they see suffering and they agonize over, what am I doing to be a part of this, or to stop this, or to help this, to resist evil? Am I doing enough? Am I doing what God would have me to do? And so when you read Cost of Discipleship, he's going to talk about cheap grace. Cheap grace that just basically says you just put time in at church each week, and other than that, you're free to live how you want. And God doesn't ask anything significant of you that's costly, that's difficult. And he's going to realize, no, when Jesus came to the disciples, they had a comfortable, safe job, fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And he said, come follow me. And all but one of them are going to end up martyred. They're going to die violent deaths, unjust deaths, many of them around the world where they went to take the gospel. And he's going to realize, no, it's a dangerous thing when Jesus shows up by your boat and says, follow me.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, even though he could have easily ridden out World War II in a comfortable chair or professorship in New York City somewhere, he realizes that if he's going to be a part of what he believes is rebuilding Germany at some point, that he needs to have kind of suffered with the people during that time as well. So he goes back to Germany, and he is appointed at first to be the principal, the president of a nonconformist seminary, training Germans to be pastors that have not sold out to the government, that are not supporting it. And he does some interesting things. I think it would have been quite fascinating to be in some of his classrooms and hear him teach and wrestling with scriptures. there's one interesting story. Of course, it's a smaller school, and everyone's got to kind of pitch in. It's during the war, and there's limited resources, and so at one point they'd had a meal together as students, and so someone's got to go in the kitchen and wash all the dishes, and so Bonhoeffer just asked if there were some students who'd be willing to go and clean up and do the dishes, and nobody's all that forthcoming, wanting that particular noble duty.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, some things don't change much, and so Bonhoeffer goes into the kitchen, just quietly gets out. He's the president. He's the top guy, and interestingly, he locks the door so that nobody can come in. And then he just begins to just single-handedly wash all the dishes from his students. Well, of course, some of the students, it becomes apparent to them what's happening, that while they're sitting there enjoying their after-meal time, the president, their beloved teacher, is doing all the work, serving them. And so there's some that actually hurriedly get up and they rush in. They want to, oh, sorry, sir, we'll do that. But he's locked the door so that none of them can get in. And they're trying to now, but he wants to make a point. Hey, next time we ask for help, don't sit there comfortably hoping someone else will do it. That you jump right away and be the one. And so, but Bonhoeffer in some ways is going to be that kind of person as well. He's well connected, and we're not aware of this as much, but there were some very prominent Germans who, from the very beginning, opposed Hitler. And we're trying to find a way to overthrow him, and they kept thinking perhaps after certain defeats or certain moments they could negotiate with England or America or somebody, and there's all kinds of plans, and part of what they're trying to do is they're just trying to document the atrocities that are taking place in concentration camps and keeping a record of that. To let the world know just how the evil of what's taking place. And so Bonhoeffer does get involved in that, and ultimately there are several attempts to take Hitler's life. And just interestingly, on several occasions, people try to put a bomb on a plane that Hitler's flying on, and then the bomb doesn't go off, or they try to put a bomb in a boardroom where he is, but the bomb gets put up against a thick wooden leg of a table and doesn't kill Hitler. And again, it's one of those theological questions you could ask, like, why wouldn't God just kind of help these righteous people trying to stop an evil madman? And yet Hitler's life is spared on several occasions, so just almost miraculously. But eventually a plot is discovered, and they trace it back, and they implicate Bonhoeffer, and so he's arrested, and will spend the last part of World War II in jail. And interesting, there's some statements that you can read about him where the chaplain, some of the various people that knew him, watching him in his final days, just said they'd never seen anybody who so radiated joy, peace, confidence in God's will. And even those witnesses who watched him on the day, and it's just kind of a tragic drama played out at the end where he and several of the other conspirators were all rounded up, sent to prison, and expected to be executed. And so they do, on a certain day, execute his compatriots, some of them all prominent people in different fields. But for some reason, Bonhoeffer had been mistakenly taken to a different prison about 100 miles away. So the day that all of his co-conspirators are being executed, Bonhoeffer's not there. And they didn't realize that at first. And so the German authorities they're looking at other prisoners and thinking that they're Bonhoeffer, and they're like, no, that's not who I am. And so they actually had to go track him down, and finally figured out he's 100 miles away. They had to ship a couple people down there to get him and bring him back, and so he's almost spared. And literally within about 3 weeks of the end of the war, He's so close to making it, but
those deaths that occurred, right before liberation, always seem to be the most tragic.
They are, and you think, and a person like him that was so close to surviving that, and he had intended to be a part of the solution, part of the rebuild. That was his intent, but that won't be what God has for him. And sadly, he actually gets engaged to a young woman to be married, but they're separated, of course, when he gets put in jail, and so they never do actually have the wedding. But you watch a man trying to, he's a person who wants love, wants a relationship, wants a family, but he also knows that God has called him, and he has to follow where Jesus leads him. And so he writes some letters that are quite impactful. And the person who wrote later, witnessing Bonhoeffer the day that he is sent to the gallows, the day he ascends the steps up to be hung, and the witnesses said that they'd never seen anybody with such peace, such calm, such resignation to the will of God. And of course, it just seems so tragic to us. Here's this brilliant Christian who could have made such a difference in rebuilding Germany, and his life seems like such a waste to be killed at age 39 when he's just tried to do what's right and to resist evil. But of course, there's people doing podcasts like this, some 80 or so years after the fact, still impacted by his life. And of course, you always wonder, would his life have had as much impact if he had not been tragically put to death early? If he'd lived in ripe old age, he would have written more and taught more, but there's something quite powerful about a life where he practiced what he preached. And he followed Jesus just like the first disciples to his own martyrdom for the cause of Christ. And so he's a person he's just a fascinating person. It's not a black and white, just very clear-cut picture. He's on a journey, like we said. He started out as a pacifist, and then he realizes there's some that works fine in modern societies oftentimes, but sometimes you come across an evil of such horrendous proportions that negotiating, turning the other cheek maybe doesn't work. There are times where evil has to be resisted, and so you watch his theology, his ethics changing, just not being compromised, but just trying to grapple with reality of what he's facing, and to realize some of the things he just assumed in the comfort of some intellectual classroom. When you get out in the real world amongst evil and wickedness and pain and suffering, sometimes you got to go back to God and say, did I misunderstand that? Or maybe there's a clear understanding of what that means for me. And so a fascinating story that continues to just captivate people, of a person trying to live out an ethic in the midst of one of the most evil regimes ever in human history. And Hitler and Bonhoeffer on different trajectories trying to sort out how do you relate one to the other. And so certainly a great read. I've read Eric Metaxas' book on Bonhoeffer. I've also read his Cost of Discipleship. He's also got some other interesting books as well, I think Life Together. But I encourage you to catch the movie about him. I haven't seen it yet as this podcast is being done, but it's one I wouldn't mind seeing. And of course, there's always literary and license taken, some of the creative content, but
sure,
we know enough about him to have a good sense of his thoughts and how he lived. So it'd be really interesting to see how they handle that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll leave links to the biography that you mentioned there in the show notes. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.